Johannes. Thank you everyone for being here. It's a real pleasure to be here. So thank you also to the program committee for this opportunity. So when describing the way that Johannes Brahms performed, pianist Fanny Davis said that he belonged to a school of playing, and I'm quoting, which begins its phrases well, ends them well, and leaves plenty of space between the end of one and the beginning of another, and yet joins them without any hiatus, end of quote. So Davis is speaking to a concern for performers with a moment of transition between two musical phrases and its correspondent opportunity for structural articulation in performance, either to underline that formal division by creating a hiatus, alternatively to safeguard the continuity of the discourse by eschewing any obvious form of articulation, or like Brahms in Davis' formulation, to somehow manage to do both. In any event, the use of annotated rallentando at the end of a phrase, or annotated phrase final lengthening, the often used term borrowed from linguistics, is an effective device to create a perceived separation between phrases. And the systematic use of this device has been identified in comparative analysis of 20th century recordings of instrumental Western classical music. Nicholas Cook, for instance, has noticed it in a great number of recordings of Chopin's mazurkas as an element of phrase arching, an integrated interpretative system at the phrase level whereby tempo and dynamics flow and ebb together, commonly found in recordings made after World War II. In her PhD thesis, Ines Stanovic found that a number of early 20th century string players and pianists whose recordings she analyzed prioritized four-bar phrasal units, highlighting the end of each phrase by lengthening its last bar. While this is true, the systematic structural segmentation of the musical discourse at the phrase level has also been taken for granted and generalized as a normative feature in formalist models of expressive timing and performance designed by various researchers in past decades. In these models, musical interpretation is assumed to be the result of an interiorization of musical structure, and unnotated deviations in expressive elements, agogics and dynamics, as compared to the score, are seen as closely related and a response to structural elements. In this framework, it follows that a systematic phrase final lengthening in proportion to the degree of formal importance of each given phrase allows for a hierarchization of musical structure that is supposedly required for clarity and adequate comprehension by the listener. This premise, in fact, has a long and distinguished history in 20th century instrumental teaching, and it still circulates in recent musicological works, with mentions, for instance, to the invariability of slowing at the end of structural units in performance, or to phrase final lengthening as part of a shared cognitive representation of musical structure. Systematic phrase final lengthening, in short, is often assumed to be a natural, intrinsically correct and expressive way of clearly organizing a musical discourse. The corresponding segmentation of musical discourse at the phrase level through agogics appears in this narrative as a universally desirable feature of performance for the sake of a supposedly necessary structural clarification. However, Heinrich Schenker wrote in the early years of the 20th century that, I quote, "The requirement that a composition's form not to be exposed too nakedly frequently demands considerably quicker playing where the theme occurs," end of quote. And in fact, Cook has noticed how Eugene Dalbert, Emil von Sauer, and Vladimir de Pachmann sometimes characteristically rush towards and through cadences. In an article published in 2023, Stanovic and Billet mention how horn player Charles Heilbrook, a quote, concludes the phrases with truncated endings as if rushing to the following phrase, end of quote. So this striking avoidance of systematic segmentation at the phrase level indicates wholly different priorities for these performers when dealing with points of formal articulation in performance. And it seems, in fact, to point to an opposite strategy to phrase final lengthening in dealing with musical structure. What then does the evidence of recordings made during the first half of the 20th century suggest in terms of strategies of formal articulation at the phrase level and of their evolution? And in particular, how do Schenker's and earlier generations compare with later performers? In order to get a sense of how strategies of formal articulation evolved between early recorded pianists and later generations, I undertook a comparative analysis of all available commercial recordings made until the mid-20th century of 5 piano works by Brahms. These recordings span 50 years, starting with the first commercial recording of the Waltz, Opus 39, number 15, by Clara Schumann's pupil and Brahms' protégée Ilona Eibenschütz in 1903, and they include pianists born from the 1850s to the 1930s, and from a variety of backgrounds, though admittedly mostly Germanic. The choice of Brahms as a composer came from my PhD project and had to do with the perception that an early 20th century avant-garde had of his importance for the advent of a modernist framework for thinking music and performance in a novel, objective, anti-romantic, analytical, and restrained, somewhat classicist way. The choice of pieces followed three criteria: having the greatest number of recordings for comparison, encompassing a wide enough variety of generations and backgrounds, and showcasing a variety of contrasting tempi and character, allowing for potential diversity of expressive resources. The analysis was computer-assisted, using sonic visualizer to map the tempo at beat level for each recording. And for the sake of our limited time, I will be focusing this presentation mostly on the results of the comparative analysis of the Capriccio Opus 76 No. 2, a particularly interesting subject in its formal symmetries, but also asymmetries and ambiguities, which has been continuously recorded since the dawn of the age of recordings. So the performers whose recordings have been analyzed for this study show a variety of different attitudes towards structural clarity by segmentation, in a spectrum from great continuity, even between large sections, to the point of sometimes ignoring explicit indications in the score, to the articulation of boundaries between every single phrase. Good examples of the contrasting archetypes at each end of the spectrum are the recording of the Capriccio made in 1908 by Alfred Grönfeld, an Austrian pianist born in 1852, and one of the earliest performers to have made recordings, and the one made in 1947 by Aline van Barensen, a French-American pianist born in 1897, who studied in Paris, Berlin, and Vienna. Whereas Grönfeld plays through most phrases in larger formal divisions without any kind of slowing down, Barensen clearly articulates most of them, with a particularly pronounced rallentando in those instances where the formal division separates structural units based on different thematic materials. Among all of the moments of potential formal articulation in which these two performers present contrasting strategies, I will highlight two places where there is no agogical indication in the score, and two others where Brahms is arguably explicit in mentioning tempo modification. In our first example, which lacks any agogical indications by the composer, Grönfeld not only does not slow down at all, as he actually slightly anticipates the start of the next phrase by rushing through and shortening the very end of the last bar in the first phrase. Barensen, on the other hand, chooses to underline the transition between phrases through a sudden pronounced rallentando at the end of the first one, starting straight a tempo at the beginning of the next. In our next example, where agogical indications are equally absent, the same thing happens. Grönfeld again slightly anticipates the first note of what would be the new phrase by slightly rushing the second half of the last bar of the previous one. With Barensen, by contrast, just before the last phrase of the piece, she highlights the end of the previous phrase by slowing down, and thus lengthening its final bar. In the next two examples, we have indications by the composer relating to tempo. The first one, the transition from the first large section of the piece to the contrasting central section, is marked by Brahms as poco a poco espressivo, into a marking of più tranquillo. While Grönfeld admittedly starts the new section in a slightly lower tempo, he doesn't seem to see in Brahms' indications an implication of rallentando, or simply doesn't follow it. The beginning of the first melody note of the next section is merely slightly delayed. Though in effect this means that the final bar of the previous section was lengthened, this is actually masked by Grönfeld's use of hand dislocation with the bass note and arpeggiation, resulting in a sense of continuous playing in spite of the melodic delay. Perhaps what Davis meant as the way Brahms articulated phrasal divisions without creating a hiatus. Contrary-wise, Barensen, like earlier, stresses the end of the previous section agogically by lengthening it with a broad rallentando, which starts exactly where Brahms marked poco a poco on the score, and then starts the new section with a gentle accelerando until reaching a stable new tempo a couple of bars later. The hiatus is clearly emphasized. Finally, in a transition which Brahms expressly marked senza ritardando, both performers ignore that indication and slow down, although Grönfeld's subtle lengthening of the final bar is almost imperceptible when compared to Barensen's very obvious one. Here's Grönfeld. And here's Barensen's. The analysis of the remaining 15 recordings of this piece provided us with a clearer picture of how different approaches to the articulation of its formal divisions evolved between the two paradigms of continuity and segmentation represented by Grönfeld and Barensen. In what concerns continuity, a transition between structural units is either kept free from tempo modification or is rushed towards an anticipation of the beginning of the following phrase. And this latter strategy of rushing can only be heard in the recordings by Grönfeld, Frederick Lamond, and on occasion Eugene d'Albert. This is relevant in that these three pianists are the earliest born pianists who have recorded this piece, which suggests that when Schenker recommended quicker playing where the theme occurs, he might have been referring to an established practice from his time and before. In what concerns segmentation, on the other hand, it is nearly absent in these pianists. They only subtly underline very few formal divisions and dilute any potential feeling of hiatus by the use of hand dislocation and or arpeggiation with an anticipated bass note at the beginning of the new phrase. Most other performers are closer to Barensen, even if not every phrasal division is always emphasized. Next, I was interested in seeing whether there was a correlation between a higher degree of global segmentation of the piece, there being more events of phrasal division through phrase final lengthening, and three factors: the pianist's background with a somewhat problematic notion of a school of performance, the date of recording, and the performer's date of birth. And in order to compare the degrees of segmentation of different recordings and to be able to make the results visually clear by plotting them onto a graph, I counted the number of events of phrase final lengthening for each recording, weighing each of those events with its respective percentage of rallentando. These comparisons suggest that there might be some influence of different piano schools in the degree of segmentation, although only to a certain extent. And in fact, there is not enough data here to come to definite conclusions in this respect. And generally speaking, several pianists who could be categorized as from a German school in the first column seem to have a lower degree of segmentation than those from a putative English school and those from a Hungarian background in the fourth and fifth column respectively. However, in what concerns Germanic backgrounds, pupils of distinguished pedagogues Karl Heinrich Spaht in the second column and Theodor Leschetizky in the third column are among those who most and more markedly bring out formal divisions. Kempf is the exception here with a moderate level of segmentation. There is among these examples of a Germanic tradition, therefore, little uniformity in terms of practices of segmentation to phrase level. This evidence suggests, at most, the existence of different German schools of thought on this matter. And furthermore, various mixed piano genealogies, and the case of the avowed autodidact Harold Bauer, should prevent us from making too many assumptions based on the pianist's educational background. The fact remains that, in terms of other interpretational parameters, many of them share both similarities and significant differences, irrespective of their school. In what concerns the relationship between the date of recording and the degree of segmentation in a given performance, there was no correlation to be found. By plotting segmentation against the birth date of performers, on the other hand, there was a correlation, suggesting that the time when a performer was born is a crucial factor for this aspect of structural clarification. In fact, not only Grönfeld is both the earliest performer in the group and has the least segmented performance, but all three other earlier pianists, d'Albert, Lamond, and Bauer, also stay well below most of the later ones in that respect. What comes across as striking in this chart is how suddenly from the generations born around 1880 onwards, there is a greater variety in the amount of formal divisions that are emphasized, with some pianists on the lower end of the trend and some that, on the contrary, separate all structural units and even make intraphrasal divisions within each structural unit. From what we gather from the performance of this piece, whereas earlier pianists seem to favor a more continuous discourse in which the clarification of formal divisions through phrase final lengthening comes as an exception that is meant only for certain specific endings, from the 1880 generation onwards, the tendency seems to be to emphasize more of these formal divisions. As we've mentioned before, some Germanically trained pianists tend to keep a less segmented discourse than their Hungarian or English counterparts, but for each school there is an upward trend. The performances of the remaining pieces, which make up a total of over 90 recordings, are aligned with this trend, with a comparative analysis of Opus 117, number 1, showing a very clear linear, almost linear evolution, while the Waltz, Opus 39, number 15, and especially the Rhapsody, Opus 79, number 2, contain more outliers. But there is mostly in these recordings a group of performances by earlier pianists whose degree of segmentation is overwhelmingly lower, and another by later ones in which it is quite consistently higher, while in the generation born around the 1880s and 1890s, contrasting approaches seem to coexist to a wider degree. This raises the hypothesis that this generation was somehow pivotal in the transformation of the practice of segmentation into a more systematic device, with some particular individuals possibly bearing more responsibility and opening up the practice for later pianists. Going back to those studies I mentioned earlier that found the use of systematic phrase final lengthening, most of the examples of the practice were in fact by performers born around or after 1880, while counterexamples and or less pronounced practice of segmentation in those analyses often came from earlier generations. Further systematic studies would be necessary in order to confirm this trend, namely with other repertoires and a greater diversity of performers, and also so as to understand whether there have been significant geographical differences in what concerns variations in this practice during the early 20th century. But this tendency through successive generations towards a more segmented and analytical form of performing the work resonates with a variety of factors that developed and eventually took significant hold of musical thought between the late 19th and early 20th century, particularly shifts in musical theory and in aesthetics in the arts at large concerning the understanding of what the work of art is and what it can and should or not represent will have contributed to this change of framework. If we look into this apparent imperative of continuity in earlier 19th century generations, it is somewhat comparable to a mimetic Schopenhauerian and romantic aesthetic framework, wherein music at its unfolding in time mirrored human life and desire. And in this context, as scholar Sanna Pedersen has noted, Schopenhauer equates musical cadence with the satisfaction of desire or the will, so a musical composition that mirrors life should never end, just as desires never end until death, end of quote. A leap could be made from the compositional to the performative context of a melody. If a cadence that marks the end point of a phrase or of greater formal units is a point of repose in itself, in a Schopenhauerian framework, this moment should merely be a point of transition to a new impulse of will and or desire, springing again to the following melodic impetus without indulging in cadential satisfaction. In the earliest generations in our recordings, the overwhelming lack of phrase final lengthening, or indeed the practice of rushing at the end of phrases, could thus be seen as a device to avoid the feeling of permanence created by the finality of a phrasal cadence, leaping instead constantly to the next phrase in a never-moving melody as metaphor of the romantic ever becoming. We find clues to this imperative of continuity throughout the writings and editions of various pianists of these generations, such as Tobias Matthey, Ferruccio Busoni, or Hans von Bülow. While they were very interested in how to shape the musical phrase and favor the use of agogical manipulation within the phrase, they mostly restricted the use of final lengthening only to higher levels of formal articulation rather than individual phrase endings. And they advised phrasal boundaries to be marked with a small caesura that merely breaks the legato, or a stress on the first note of the new phrase, which thereby did not interrupt the forward impetus of the melodic flow at each transition between phrases, like a final rallentando would. Phrases should be made discernible, but without sacrificing the overall drive from the one to the next. By contrast, the more modernist framework of thought became more widely consolidated in pianists within the Austro-German tradition born between around 1880 and 1900, who embraced an ideology of absolute music. In other arts, radical ideas of aesthetic autonomy, of an art focused purely on its own specific means and devices, had become a hallmark of various avant-garde currents by the early 20th century. And some of these pianists similarly saw themselves as leading the way into a new age of performance, one in which, through their ideology of aesthetic autonomy, they held a dual aspiration: to overcome romanticism, its associations to theatricality and virtuosity, and the subjective trap of romantic performance, and to glimpse and convey a work's real and objective artistic truth, relying thereby on the analysis of the putatively autonomous musical phenomenon in and of itself, without any contamination by external factors that could mask its essential truth. All of this in accordance with coeval developments in musical theory. In Edvard Steuermann's words, it was the tenets of modernist composition of his time that created the basis for a form of analysis that allowed the performer to have at their disposal the knowledge and exact insight into the essence of form and structure, also in the music of earlier periods. And thereby, the entrance into every world of musical thought lies open to us. Various of these pianists were connected to, or avowedly strongly interested in, specific theorists and their novel ideas on a musical phrase and of its necessary clear delineation, aiming for its aesthetic perception as an individual entity that participates in the construction of the work as a whole. These pianists therefore actively took part in the aesthetic shifts of European art in the 1920s, the coming of age of this generation, with their emphasis on a novel classicality coded as restrained, clear, intellectual, and objective. This radically autonomous framework supposedly precluded metaphorical approaches to music, such as music mirroring life or the will. And like the Weimar-era architecture of their time, these pianists sought artistic essence in what was purely structural in the work, what Steuermann calls the constructive element, and meant to emphatically clarify it in performance. And of course, the performance of structure they carried out was not necessarily done in any simplistic or formulaic way. Again, like the best examples of architecture in the same period, it sought to respond to specific and complex functional needs as they appeared in each case. And an attentive listening to these recordings reveals how formal clarification at the phrase level was carefully balanced with harmonic drive and wider scale voice leading, among other factors. Of course, as various commentators then and now have pointed out, a radically autonomist ideology of absolute music is ultimately bound to be an untenable premise, and there is no lack of contradictions on the subject in this pivotal generation of pianists. But this ideology was nonetheless productive in contributing to the spread of novel analytical frameworks that these pianists appear to have started consolidating into a contrasting performance style to their predecessors, of which the increase in segmentation was a symptom. These frameworks presented performers with new ways of facing older repertoire, ways that were closely aligned with the ideological and theoretical developments of their own age, which is something that Steuermann, again, felt performers should always strive for, something that allowed for, in his words, the possibility of perpetual rejuvenation of musical works throughout time. In essence, then, while more evidence would be welcome to support this, the quasi-systematization of phrase final lengthening seems to have emerged as a corollary in performance of particular developments in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, namely in musical theory and the rise of modernist aesthetics. Rather than natural or universal, it might therefore be interesting to see it mainly as a culturally and historically contingent phenomenon. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Luis.